All right, so are you ready to kind of dive a little deeper into oral fixation in autistic adults?
Yeah.
We've got a great excerpt here from the blog post, Adult Autism and Oral Fixation, Understanding the Connection. It's from Cheap ABA. And I have to say, this is a topic that really makes you think. Ever get yourself like chewing on your pen cap or constantly eating gum? Turns out there's a lot more to it than just a little habit, especially for those on the autism spectrum.
Absolutely. Oral fixation is that urge to bite, chew, or suck on things. We often associate it with childhood, but it can definitely continue into adulthood, particularly for autistic individuals.
So let's unpack this a little bit. The blog post really emphasizes the connection between autism and this oral fixation. What is
Yeah.
the underlying reason for that?
Well, one of the key factors here is the way autistic individuals experience sensory input. So think of it this way. For some, the mouth is like this high-definition sensory experience. It offers this really intense and unique feedback that can be incredibly calming or even pleasurable.
Oh, that's interesting. Could you describe like what types of oral sensations might be especially pleasurable or calming for someone with autism?
Sure, it varies from person to person. But, imagine the feeling of smooth, rounded surfaces, the firmness of a chewy object, or the crispness of a crunchy snack. These sensations can provide this kind of grounding and focus, especially in a world that often feels overwhelming from a sensory perspective.
I see. So it's like creating a controlled sensory environment in a world that can feel really chaotic sometimes.
Yeah.
But the blog post also mentions anxiety and stress relief as contributing factors. How does that tie in?
Well, think about what happens when you bite your nails when you're nervous. Chewing and sucking on things actually releases endorphins, those natural mood boosters. So it's like a built-in way to calm the nervous system. For someone with autism who might experience anxiety more intensely or more often, oral fixation can become a go-to strategy for finding a bit of relief.
That makes sense. It's almost like self-soothing, but instead of a warm bath, it's chewing on something. I remember reading in the article that some people find it helpful to kind of journal to identify like what triggers their anxiety. Do you think that could be a useful tool for somebody who is dealing with oral fixation that's maybe related to stress?
Absolutely. Keeping a journal to kind of track your oral fixation, noting, the situations, emotions, even sensory experiences that seem to trigger it can be incredibly insightful. It's like shining a light on those subconscious patterns. It helps you become more aware of what sets you off. That awareness is a powerful tool for managing anxiety in a proactive way.
So instead of just reacting to the urge to chew, you can start to anticipate it and maybe even find other ways to kind of manage those stressful moments.
Exactly. Maybe it's practicing some deep breathing exercises when you feel that familiar tension building, or having a fidget toy on hand to redirect that energy.
It's like having a personalized toolkit to manage those urges. That's really helpful advice, especially for our listener out there who's really trying to get a handle on this. Now, there's another really intriguing point the blog post raises. It suggests that oral fixation can sometimes be linked to communication difficulties. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Yes, this is where things get really interesting. For some autistic individuals, oral fixation can be a way of expressing themselves. When words feel out of reach or insufficient, it might manifest as increased chewing or sucking when they're feeling frustrated or overwhelmed, or even as a way to signal that they need a break from a situation or an activity.
Oh, so it's almost like their own unique way of communicating their needs and emotions. That's fascinating. The blog post didn't really go into a ton of detail about this. Can you give some specific examples of how oral fixation might be used as a form of communication?
Sure, let's say a child is engaged in a play activity that they're finding increasingly frustrating. They might start chewing on their shirt sleeve as a way of expressing that frustration, especially if they haven't yet developed the language skills to say, "This is too hard," or "I need help."
That makes a lot of sense. I've definitely seen kids do that. It's easy to misinterpret that as just being fidgety, but it sounds like it could be much more than that. Are there other examples maybe for adults?
Absolutely. An adult who is feeling overwhelmed in a social situation might start chewing on a pen cap or their fingernails as a way of self-regulating and signaling that they need a break from the interaction.
So it's a way of communicating, I need a moment to myself without having to explicitly say it. It's almost like a subtle cue to those around them.
Precisely. And it underscores the importance of being attuned to these nonverbal cues, especially when interacting with autistic individuals.
It makes you realize how much we might miss if we're not paying attention to those subtle forms of communication. It's a reminder to be more observant and to try to understand the meaning behind the behavior. Now, the blog post also talks about finding ways to manage oral fixation,
Mm.
especially when it becomes disruptive or interferes with daily life. What are some of the key strategies that you found to be effective?
Well, it's important to remember that the goal isn't necessarily to eliminate oral fixation altogether. For many autistic individuals, it serves a valuable purpose. It's more about finding ways to make it work for them in a way that's safe and healthy and doesn't cause problems in their lives.
So it's about finding that balance between honoring the need and finding ways to manage it effectively.
Exactly. For example, if someone is constantly chewing on inedible objects like pencils or clothing, it might be helpful to introduce chewable jewelry or safe, non-toxic chew toys. These provide that same satisfying oral input, but in a way that's much safer.
That's a great point. I've seen those chewable necklaces advertised, but I never really understood who they were for. It makes so much more sense now.
There are actually so many different options available these days: pendants, bracelets, even keychains. They come in a variety of textures and firmness levels, so you can find something that really suits the individual's sensory preferences.
So it's about finding the right tool for the job, so to speak.
Precisely, and sometimes it's about redirecting the behavior to something more appropriate for the setting. For instance, if someone starts chewing on their fingers during a meeting, you could subtly offer them a piece of gum or straw to sip on.
It's about providing a discreet and socially acceptable way to meet that need. I like that approach. It's not about shaming or stopping the behavior, but about finding a healthier alternative. The blog post also mentions the importance of addressing any underlying issues, like anxiety or stress that might be contributing to the oral fixation. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Of course, sometimes oral fixation is a symptom of a larger issue. If someone is using it as their primary coping mechanism for overwhelming anxiety, then addressing that anxiety directly is crucial.
So it's like treating the root cause, not just the symptom.
Precisely. And that's where professional help can be incredibly valuable. A therapist can help the individual develop healthy coping mechanisms, learn stress reduction techniques, and address any underlying mental health concerns that might be fueling the oral fixation.
It's about taking a holistic approach, recognizing that there might be multiple factors at play.
Exactly. And that's where self-awareness becomes so important. The more an individual understands their own triggers and patterns, the better equipped they are to seek out the right kind of support and develop effective coping strategies.
It's about empowering them to take control of their own well-being.
Absolutely. And it's never too late to seek help or learn new skills. There are resources available for individuals of all ages. And the journey to self-discovery and self-management is an ongoing process.
It's inspiring to hear that there's always hope and always room for growth. Now, before we wrap up, I want to circle back to something we talked about earlier, the idea of oral fixation as a form of communication. I think it's such a powerful concept, and one that I'm still processing.
It is a powerful reminder that communication isn't always about words. For some autistic individuals, oral fixation might be their most effective way of expressing emotions, needs, or even thoughts that they struggle to articulate verbally.
So it's about recognizing and respecting those different ways of communicating.
Absolutely. Everyone communicates differently, and for some nonverbal expressions are just as meaningful, if not more so, than words.
That's such an important message. So if someone we know engages in oral fixation, how can we better understand what they might be trying to communicate?
It all starts with observation. Pay attention to the context in which the behavior occurs. Is it happening during times of stress or excitement? Is it associated with certain activities or environments?
So it's like being a detective looking for clues to decipher the message.
Exactly. And as you start to notice patterns, you can begin to make educated guesses about what the behavior might mean.
For instance, if someone starts chewing on their sleeve when they're feeling overwhelmed in a social situation, it could be their way of saying, I need a break.
Precisely. Or if they start sucking on their fingers when they're concentrating on a difficult task, it could be their way of self-soothing or focusing their attention.
It's amazing how much we can learn about someone
What?
simply by tuning into their nonverbal cues.
It really is. And it underscores the importance of being sensitive to the unique ways in which each individual communicates, especially those who might communicate differently than we do.
It's about meeting people where they are and respecting their individual modes of expression. This has been such an insightful conversation. I feel like I have a much deeper understanding of oral fixation now, not just as a behavior, but as a window into the sensory and emotional experiences of autistic individuals. It really has been. And, thinking back to the beginning of our deep dive, I was struck by something you said about the mouth being this source of intense sensory input. for some autistic individuals. And it just made me wonder, could there be a connection between oral fixation and like the enjoyment of certain foods or textures?
Hmm. That's a really insightful connection. We often talk about how certain sounds or visual stimuli can be either soothing or overwhelming for people with autism. So it stands to reason that the same would apply to taste and texture.
Yeah. So someone who finds comfort in chewing might also have strong preferences for like crunchy foods or foods with a particular mouthfeel.
Exactly. Think about the sensory experience of biting into a crisp apple or the smooth, creamy texture of yogurt. Those sensations can be incredibly pleasing for anyone, but they might be even more pronounced for someone with heightened oral sensitivity.
It's like their taste buds are turned up to 11. I imagine that could also lead to some challenges, though, especially for parents trying to introduce new foods to their autistic children.
You're absolutely right. It can be quite a hurdle. A child who is hypersensitive to certain textures might be extremely resistant to trying new foods, especially if they look or feel unfamiliar.
So patience and understanding are key in those situations.
Absolutely. It's about respecting their sensory experiences and finding ways to gradually introduce new foods, maybe by focusing on familiar textures or flavors at first.
And maybe offering those safe and comforting oral experiences through like chew toys
Mhm.
or other alternatives in the meantime.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance. Now, I know we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, but there's one final point from the Cheap ABA blog post I'd love to touch on. They emphasize the importance of self-advocacy for adults with oral fixation.
That's a great point. What does self-advocacy look like in this context?
Well, it could be as simple as explaining to a coworker why you need to have gum during a meeting, or being upfront with friends about your need to chew on something when you're feeling anxious.
So it's about communicating your needs and helping others understand why those needs are important.
Precisely. And it's about advocating for accommodations that make life a little easier. Maybe that means bringing a chewable necklace to a social gathering,
Huh.
or asking for a quiet space to retreat to if you're feeling overwhelmed.
It's about owning your needs and feeling empowered to ask for what you need, to feel comfortable and supported. This has been such a valuable conversation. I feel like we've really gone beyond just understanding oral fixation as a behavior and really delved into what it can teach us about the diverse ways in which people experience the world.
I completely agree. It's a reminder that what might seem quirky or unusual to one person can be a completely normal and even essential part of someone else's lived experience.
It's about embracing those differences and creating a world that is more inclusive, an understanding of everyone's unique needs and ways of being. So to our listener, if there's one thing I hope you take away from this deep dive, it's this. The next time you encounter someone engaging in oral fixation, try to see it not as a problem to be solved, but as a window into their sensory world and a testament to their resilience in navigating a world that isn't always designed with their needs in mind.
Beautifully said. And remember, curiosity is the key to empathy. The more we learn about the diverse ways in which people experience the world, the more compassionate and understanding we become.
And isn't that what it's all about? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into oral fixation in autistic adults. Until next time, happy exploring.